Some plans just don't work out, and we know actions have consequences. And this was war. Now 7 men stood with their boots planted firmly in this Atlanta, Georgia dirt on these final moments of their short lives.
Philip Gebhard Shadrach was a very religious man.
One of his comrades described him like this:
almost being obnoxious. When he was being taken out to be hung, he turned to the group and he said, "I'm not yet ready to meet my Jesus."
On June 18, 1862, Shadrach and the 6 others were hanged near the old Oakland Cemetery in Atlanta. 4 of the men who were executed that day hold a distinction that puts them among the most courageous and valorous to ever wear the uniform of the United States military. In every historical account of this mission, Philip Shadrach was right there with those other men at each step. But when it came to handing out the combat decorations, Shadrach was left out. And even in recent years, the White House has been close on multiple occasions to correcting this record and honoring this war hero. But to this point, nothing has happened.
I don't know if it was my first letter. I might have been a little disturbed, or if it was the last one when finally my patience ran out. But I think I essentially said something almost to the effect of, "What the hell happened?"
My name is Josh Roe, and this is Morrowtown, Tennessee. This story begins like all the great Civil War stories. A few months ago, I got a voicemail from a retired geologist near Cleveland, Ohio.
Hi, Josh. This is Ron Shadrach.
A voicemail and a familiar last name. Ron Shadrach is not a historian. At least not professionally, but he has a small mountain of research. Old letters, excerpts from books, pension records, newspaper stories, a deposition from 1863, all about one specific moment in history. I poured through every page of Ron's paperwork mountain, and the story contained in those documents is a fascinating ride.
Thanks for doing this. I really appreciate you.
Oh, thank you.
We met over Zoom a few days after he left that voicemail, and he told me all about one of his ancestors, Philip G. Shadrach.
He had 2 brothers and 2 sisters.
Philip and his family lived in western Pennsylvania.
He was 3 years old when it appears his mom died giving birth to his youngest sister, Elizabeth.
About 10 years before Ron started digging, a distant relative he never met was doing her own research.
The father couldn't take care of all the kids.
They were all orphans.
This is my grandma's great uncle. And she passed when my dad was only 19 years old. So a lot of the stories that we know have been passed down and passed down.
Jennifer Sweet lives near Akron, Ohio, about 45 minutes from Cleveland.
I'm the closest living relative, basically. Which was really weird to think about.
Jennifer and Ron both know this story well, but they didn't know each other until late last year.
It appears about 1860 or 61, he came to Ohio.
1861. That's the year Confederate troops fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, the official start of the American Civil War. 1861, also the year Philip Shadrach volunteered to defend the Union against the Great Rebellion. His life would end the following year, but not before doing a heroic thing in service to his country.
It's just been interesting things we found and mysteries, and we're wondering, what does it mean?
Philip Shadrach was one of the legendary Andrews Raiders, the raid that happened 1 year to the day after those shots were fired at Fort Sumter. The raid, often called the Great Locomotive Chase. Andrews Raiders were our country's first recipients of the Medal of Honor. 19 of those men were awarded the medal. 4 of those recipients were executed along with Shadrach, and those 4 were among the last to be awarded. Shadrach was one of 2 of those soldiers who was never awarded the Medal of Honor. All that research that Ron's been working on for years has been an effort to, after all these years, get the Medal of Honor for those two soldiers. And as I mentioned earlier, there have been occasions over the past few decades where some believed this was about to happen, but it never did. And even now, in April 2024, the paperwork is in the military office at the White House, waiting for final approval by the president. So for now, Jennifer Sweet, Ron Shadrach, and many others who are part of this story wait and work. And they've spent years waiting and working. Ron says the first several years he worked on this, he kept hitting obstacles and roadblocks.
We then, lo and behold, find out about this 150th anniversary in Kennesaw.
This happened back in 2012.
And we're invited to that.
So Ron goes, and he and his brother visit the Marietta Museum of History, Marietta, about 20 miles north of Atlanta. There, they hear a man telling the story of Andrews Raiders.
What went down and how they, what they had to do to pull this off. And we looked at each other and we thought, this is the guy who can help us.
Help them figure out what to do to get the Army, the Pentagon, the president to take another look at the Philip Shadrach story.
So we said something.
Finally, someone who can help.
He kindly shook his head no.
They thought they were in luck. Then, out of luck. And then...
I know this guy, Brad Quinlin.
Back in luck.
He's the one you want to talk to.
I was hooked on the Great Locomotive Chase real early in my research.
That voice, that's Brad. You also heard his voice at the very beginning of this episode. Brad Quinlin, historian, writes books.
How many books have you written?
Written and co-written 24.
That's a lot of books.
Yeah.
When did you start that?
84.
That guy that Ron Shadrach met at the museum knew what he was doing. Brad Quinlin is the kind of person who just might own boxes and boxes of old Civil War letters.
I have collected copies of over 23,000 Civil War letters.
See?
The Great Locomotive Chase is the reason that we have the Army Medal of Honor.
Brad is in his 60s, big energy, awesome mustache. He's been a volunteer at the Civil War battlefield in Chickamauga, Georgia for about 30 years. And just so we all understand Brad a bit better.
I've gotten to sleep on almost every part of the battlefield, so that's been fun.
So Brad was at the 150th anniversary of the chase, signing copies of a book he wrote.
Duty well performed. The story of the 21st Ohio.
The soldiers in Andrews Raiders were from 3 regiments of the Ohio Volunteer Infantry, including the 21st Ohio. Brad was signing the book when a man he didn't know walked up.
He said, "Brad, I'm Ron Shadrach," and my mouth opened. And before I could say anything, yes, I am related to Philip Gebhard Shadrach.
Ron just found the guy he was looking for.
And he looked at me and he said, "I've been trying to get the medal for Shadrach and Wilson for 4 years now. I've heard about you. Will you help me get these medals?"
So Brad went to work.
Oh, thousands of hours.
Ron's mountain of documents is also Brad's mountain of documents. Ron and Brad worked on all of this together.
Kind of kicked off this collaboration, him down there and me up here.
I sat down with Brad about a year ago in a big conference room. He opens his bags, pulls out a laptop. He shows me books.
And that's an original.
Pictures, papers.
What is that?
This is under oath documentation, 72 pages long, of 5 members of Andrews Raid testifying on exactly what happened moment by moment.
They put together a packet of well over 300 pages, making the case of why Philip Shadrach should be awarded the Medal of Honor. And they submitted the packet to the Army, requesting they take another look at the case of the Great Locomotive Chase.
Pittenger testifies, yes, George D. Wilson, Company B, 2nd Ohio Infantry.
So first of all, William Pittenger is one of Andrews' raiders. He's a big reason we know so much about the raid. He wrote several books about the raiders, giving a first-hand account of what happened. And I mentioned earlier, there were 2 soldiers who were overlooked for the Medal of Honor. There was Shadrach and there was George Davenport Wilson. Here's Brad again, where we left off. Pittenger testified, Wilson and
Shadrach, Company K, 2nd Ohio Infantry. I got under oath testimony that these men were hung and participated in the raid.
In Pittenger's book, Daring and Suffering, he said George Wilson was, quote, the most remarkable man of the whole party. He was not educated highly, though he had read a great deal. But in natural shrewdness, I rarely, if ever, saw his equal.
Let's just start at the beginning. Tell me what point in your life you started hearing stories of George Davenport Wilson?
I was pretty young. I was about 6 to 8 years old.
Ron and Brad's research has led them to many discoveries over the years. Along the way, they also found a few people named Wilson. This is Ashley Wilson.
We found out that he was my fourth great uncle.
Ashley told me her father and sister discovered a family connection to George Wilson by researching their family genealogy.
So I remember once we found him and once we found his story and put the family lineage together, my father was full of pride about George and who he was and what he did for our nation and the sacrifices that he had made. So from that point, about 8 years old, I grew up with stories of the Great Locomotive Chase and the Andrews Raiders and the speech that Uncle George had said right before he was hung.
As the 7 raiders stood on the scaffolding just before their execution, George Wilson asked to speak. At this point, the rest of the raiders were being held in a jail in Atlanta. Pittenger wrote that the prison guards told them what Wilson said. I'm going to read what Pittenger wrote in his book, Capturing a Locomotive. He wrote, he told the rebels that they were all in the wrong, that he had no hard feelings towards the Southern people for what they were about to do because they had been duped by their leaders and induced by them to engage in the work of rebellion. He also said that though he had been condemned as a spy, yet he was none, and they well knew it. He was only a soldier in the performance of the work he had been detailed to do. That he did not regret to die for his country, but only regretted the manner of his death. He concluded by assuring them in prophetic words that they would yet live to regret the part they had taken in this rebellion and would see the flag of our country wave in triumph over the very ground occupied by his scaffold. This address made a deep impression on the minds of all who listened, and I often afterwards heard it spoken of in terms of deepest admiration. When he ceased, the signal was given, and the traps fell.
My father died in 2012, and it was something that he had fought for to get to this point because they were never awarded the Medal of Honor.
Wilson and Shadrach were both executed that day, and they were the only 2 soldiers among the raiders who were never awarded or offered the Medal of Honor.
So when my father passed away, it was one of the last things that he left unfinished that he wanted done.
Wilson and Shadrach will forever be linked.
Philip Shadrach, George Davenport Wilson,
Shadrach
Wilson.
I have told this story several times, but nowhere near the number of times Brad has told this story. And that story begins with a meeting between the leader of the group, civilian scout James Andrews, and General O.M. Mitchell, who had set up camp near Shelbyville, Tennessee.
He wanted to attack and take over Chattanooga. It's an important rail line. It's a river.
So the plan.
They would take 22 Union soldiers.
Plus another civilian who happened to be at the camp. So 2 civilians and 22 soldiers total left Shelbyville on the mission.
They would go in small groups of 3 and 4.
Head to Georgia.
Steal a train called the General.
But by the time they got on that train, those 24 men were now down to 20. 2 civilians, 18 soldiers. But the plan, it was still intact. The raiders were going to race north on the train and rip up the railroad.
And then the Confederates couldn't get reinforcements from Marietta up to Chattanooga.
Then the Union takes Chattanooga and ends the war quickly. Easy. No problem.
Well, everything fell apart very quickly. William Fuller, the conductor of the General, he started chasing the train and screaming, "They're stealing my train, they're stealing my train."
A lot of that falling apart happened near and in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And today, you can find many of the places where some of the worst of the falling apart happened.
The engine ran out of wood and water at Ringgold.
There's still today a marker right next to the railroad where the train still runs today.
The marker sits right next to a road on one side, Georgia State Route 151, or Ooltewah-Ringgold Road. The railroad is on the other side of the marker and is surrounded by a few scattered small homes. The marker tells the story of Andrews Raiders and the Great Locomotive Chase.
The pursuit then was at such a rapid pace that serious damage to the railroad by the raiders was impossible. The general was abandoned by the raiders on account of lack of fuel and the close pursuit.
They had to abandon the train.
They were just under 20 miles from Chattanooga.
So they actually then were captured over the course of the next weeks.
And that is when this story takes a dark turn for the Raiders.
Taken here in Chattanooga in a prison.
There is another historical marker on Lookout Street in downtown Chattanooga that marks the spot where that jail stood. The Raiders described the jail as a dungeon, handcuffed and chained together by the neck. No windows, so no sunlight. They were crawled over by rats and mice. Terrible situation. Now, during the few weeks the Raiders were in the jail in Chattanooga, James Andrews, the civilian leader, was court-martialed there. The book, Stealing the General by Russell S. Bonds, gives us a specific location of the trial in Civil War-era Chattanooga. It's hard to imagine that scene as you walk through the downtown streets of the city today.
So back in 1862 on the corner of 4th and Market in downtown Chattanooga, that was the location of the old National Guard Armory building. In that building is where they held the court-martial for James Andrews. He was tried as a spy and convicted and sentenced to death by hanging, and he was hanged there in Atlanta, Georgia. That spot now where the National Guard Armory used to sit, there's now a Mexican restaurant there. For years, it was an Applebee's.
Andrews was taken to Atlanta and was hanged alone.
On June 7th, 1862.
The rest of the jailed Raiders were moved to Atlanta as well. 7 more of them,
including Shadrach and Wilson, were hung on June 18th, 1862.
We heard Brad tell the story of what Shadrach said as they were taking him to the gallows at the beginning of this episode.
When he was being taken out to be hung, he turned to the group and he said, "I'm not yet ready to meet my Jesus."
All 7 of the executed men were buried in a mass grave in Atlanta. Years later, their remains, along with Andrews' remains, were exhumed and moved to Chattanooga National Cemetery. The story of Andrews' Raiders can get confusing. The 24 Raiders left Shelbyville. Well, one pair was stopped near Jasper, Tennessee by Confederates, so they never even got into Georgia. So that leaves 22 men. Another pair never got word on the plan to meet up the morning of the mission, so they were asleep and missed the whole thing. When the Raiders showed up for the mission, there were 20 men, 18 soldiers, 2 civilians. Now, those 20 and the 2 who overslept were eventually captured and held in jails and prisons. Over the next several years, 19 soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor. So in that 19, that included just 16 of the 18 who were there for the whole mission, plus the 2 who were asleep and missed the mission, and 1 of the men who never made it into Georgia. The man he was with when they were stopped by the Confederate Army in Tennessee was offered the Medal of Honor, but he declined. Andrews and the other civilian, they were not eligible. So every soldier who left Shelbyville for this mission was either awarded or offered the Medal of Honor, except for Shadrach and Wilson. Here's Ron Shadrach again.
My great aunt, when she showed me the name emblazoned at the state capitol on the bronze plaque.
He went to the Ohio State Capitol when he was a young boy and saw the name Shadrach on a war memorial. Ron's aunt told him this,
that we weren't related, and she didn't want to talk about it.
This is his first memory of anything related to Philip Shadrach, and like any curious child, he kept asking questions, but all he got was...
That was something that happened down south.
So he spent his young life thinking whatever he saw on that monument didn't have anything to do with him. Jennifer Sweet had a completely different experience. She's been hearing this story most of her life.
I was probably only 4 or 5. My dad was a huge history buff.
So about 30 years ago,
It was 93.
Jennifer started digging into her family history to see if she could find someone to help correct all of this. After years of digging and writing letters, she did get a few encouraging responses from elected officials. But in the end, nothing materialized.
I just kind of lost faith that anyone would do anything.
Then, a few years after that, Ron saw a story in his local newspaper.
Backing Private Philip Shadrach and George D. Wilson for the Medal of Honor. And I'm like, wow, is this what it was I saw? And I did some research and I found out this guy had blonde hair and blue eyes, and my dad did, and I do, and his father, and I had him look up in our book, and sure enough, there was this guy in our ancestry book.
That story was about a veteran in Ohio and a former congressman trying to do the same thing Jennifer was trying to do in the 90s, and later what Ron started trying to do as well.
I called that reporter, and I got a lot of pushback, and they weren't, they denied that I existed, and it was like eye-opening.
Ron believes that reporter was told that since Philip Shadrach was an orphan, he didn't have any family members. Tracing genealogy back to someone who died 162 years ago can be complex. But the idea that Philip Gebhard Shadrach's family had no descendants, Ron and Jennifer say that's just not true.
One of Uncle Bill's children has the high chair that Perry built.
Jennifer told me the story has been passed down through the generations in her family. But did you catch the name that she just said?
I've known about Perry since I can remember.
There, Jennifer did not say, I've known about Philip.
I've known about Perry since I can remember.
So this has also complicated the process. At times it seems he went by Philip, at other times Perry.
Do you know what name he used when he joined the Army?
Charles P. Shadrach.
The family thought for years the confusion over the different names may have been why he was never honored. But now, Ron says government officials told him that's really not a factor. He says he has spent a lot of time working to clear up confusion with this story, even when talking to congressional staffers.
Well, we've looked at this and we see all the Raiders got the medal. And I'm like, no, you can find that written, but this is why we're writing, because 2 didn't. And they're like, well, it must have been that all that were going to get it had received it and it's taken care of. And it's like, no. And then they had another say, well, Mr. Shadrach, we see that Shadrach was ineligible because he enlisted under an assumed name. Is there anything else we can do for you, sir?
You can understand why this might get frustrating.
It's like, I'm not going to write another letter and try and explain this.
To be awarded the Medal of Honor, the recommendation must be submitted within 3 years of the combat action and must be awarded within 5 years. If more time has passed, then you have to get authorization from Congress. In the 2008 National Defense Authorization Act that was signed into law by President George W. Bush, Congress authorized and requested the Medal of Honor be presented to 5 men. Shadrach and Wilson were named in the legislation. The other 3 heroes have all been awarded the Medal of Honor.
It's just sad that since Bush approved it back in 2008, the generation before me is gone. My dad and his brother that talked about what he did for his country. Dad passed in 2016, and Uncle Bill, the one who fought in World War II, passed away at the age of 95 in 2019. So 11 years, something could have been done. Yeah, I just don't have any faith in bureaucracy. I have absolutely no faith that they'll take care of it.
I know that's disappointing to know how many generations your family have known this story and have known that he wasn't honored. I can understand why that's difficult.
Yeah. Yeah.
This was also close to happening back in 2016. But according to a document Ron received, the case was forwarded by the Secretary of the Army to the Secretary of Defense to forward to the President for his final decision. That document says the Secretary of Defense sent the case back with no explanation. Again, that was 2016, President Obama's final year in office.
I actually wrote 3 or 4 letters to President Obama. I don't know if it was my first letter. I might have been a little disturbed, or if it was the last one when finally my patience ran out. But I think I essentially said something almost to the effect of, what the hell happened?
There is a thread that connects everyone you've heard from in this story. Ron, Jennifer, Brad, Ashley, her family, even the people behind that newspaper story Ron saw many years ago. All of them heard about Wilson and Shadrach and thought, I'm going to do something about this. And all those people are not alone. There are several people in Chattanooga, Tennessee working now to see that these two heroes are honored. The congressman in Tennessee's 3rd District, Chuck Fleischman, told me in September that Shadrach and Wilson will be awarded the Medal of Honor. It's now just a question of when. Also, the people behind the Charles H. Coolidge National Medal of Honor Heritage Center in Chattanooga have been pushing for this. This is spokesperson Vince Butler at an event in January.
We believe their packet has been approved. It is sitting on the president's desk awaiting his signature. We know in 24, sometime this year, the president's supposed to sign that.
And retired 4-star General B.B. Bell has been working on this as well. He said this during his remarks at the funeral for Captain Larry Taylor in early February, speaking about the Medal of Honor recipients who are buried at Chattanooga National Cemetery.
Wilson and Shadrach will join them soon, I'm sure, and I pray.
I can tell from the way you talk about it that it's been hard on you in a lot of ways. It's been stressful in a lot of ways. Can you just explain that? Just kind of like the toll is kind of taken on you and the time you put into it and all those things?
Well, I don't know if it's a toll. It's a beautiful, amazing thing. And I think we're very fortunate to be part of it.
Over these years of fighting to make sure Shadrach and Wilson are not forgotten, Ron has learned about family history he never knew. He met family members he never knew existed, and members of George Wilson's family as well. If and when the White House makes an announcement that Philip G. Shadrach and George D. Wilson will be awarded the Medal of Honor, they will all be thrilled by this news. But at the same time, they've lost a lot of Shadrachs and Wilsons over the last 162 years who also would have loved to be here for that moment.
In doing this, we've lost a whole generation. A whole generation of families gone. And, but we have another generation. And I've got 7 grandkids, and so they'll see this, and they're at the age when I first discovered this.
If you would like to learn more about Andrews Raiders, I've included the resources I used to help me tell this story in the show notes in this episode of Tomorrowtown, Tennessee. This podcast is a production of News Channel 9, Fox Chattanooga, and Sinclair Broadcast Group Chattanooga. I hope you join me again real soon.